Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Wenham Museum. My name is Kristen Noon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Wenham Museum. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you back, and this, the museum's 100th anniversary year for the start of our 2022-2023 Brown Bag Lunch program series. This series has had a little bit of disruption due to the COVID pandemic. We've done some virtually and some in person, but we're really thrilled to be launching the series again this year with some in-person programming. And we're very thankful to the Institution for Savings for sponsoring this series in order to make it a free community event. So thank you to them. We will be here on the third Thursday of every month, and we encourage you to come on back next month when our speaker will be speaking about local shipwrecks off the coast of the North Shore. But today, however, we're all here for something else. It's wonderful to see so many folks from Town Hall and some of our selectmen, Peter Clay and Gary Cheeseman here, and Margaret Hoffman from Planning, and Kate, who I just recently met. It's great to have so many folks, and Ernest Ashley, one of our water commissioners. So we'll be hearing from him a little bit later as well. Today's speaker is Erin Bonney Casey from the Ipswich River Watershed Association. Erin has a very impressive title, which I'm going to read to make sure I get this accurate. She is the Planning and Resiliency Program Manager for the Watershed. And she's here to talk a bit about Wenham's water, its past, its present, and its future. You know, many folks, when they think of Wenham or Wenham Lake, if you're familiar with the community, you probably think of the ice harvesting industry that functioned here for many times. But that was only, I think, really one part of Wenham's story about water. Wenham, when it was first named, as many of you may know, was called Enon, after a biblical reference to a place with much water. So between the Wenham Swamp, Wenham Lake, the Watershed area, the Canal, I was surprised to learn during our master planning meeting we had here for the town of Wenham how much of the community actually really is wetlands and is really not buildable, you know, for that reason. So there's so much water here, and with the recent droughts and things that we had, it's a great time, I think, to take a second look at that resource, its past, and more importantly, its future. So Erin runs numerous programs for the watershed area. She holds a Master of Science from Oxford University in Water Resource Management and Policy. And we're thrilled to invite her today as the expert on this topic to speak to all of us. So thank you, Erin. Yeah.
Thank you all. I'm so happy to be here. So this program is put on by Greenscapes. Greenscapes is a coalition of Ipswich River Watershed Association, Salem Sound Coast Watch, and the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission, as well as all of our member communities, of which Wenham is one. With that coalition, our service area essentially stretches from Lynn in the south all the way to the New Hampshire border. And we help communities in that region with issues of water conservation and responsible stormwater management. And a big piece of the Greenscapes mission is public education. So we do programming in 5th grade classrooms, which is where I was this morning. We do a lot of educating of town officials, and we also do education programs like this one for the general community. So we're absolutely thrilled to be here today. This is my favorite picture of myself. As Kristen said, my name is Erin Bonney Casey. I'm the Planning and Resiliency Program Manager for the Ipswich River Watershed Association. And what that rather wordy title means is that I work with stakeholders around the Ipswich watershed to promote water conservation. Most of the stakeholders that I engage with are at the town level. So I spend a lot of time working with municipal officials on the decisions that are being made by towns on their water and stormwater management. But I also work with state officials on the regulations that are impacting local water supplies, as well as the 350,000 community members that rely on Ipswich River watershed water for their drinking water supplies. So when Chris and I first started talking about me coming here to do this Brown Bag Lunch series, we were talking about raising awareness about the water issues that face the Wenham community. And I thought this is going to be perfect for a conversation at a history museum, because you can't talk about water issues, or you can't understand water issues, especially on the North Shore, without a thorough understanding of the history that got us to where we are today. And one of the reasons that I work in this field and that I love the water field is that it is extremely interdisciplinary. So we're going to touch on hydrology, geography, history, economics, politics, maybe a little bit of law in this presentation today. And it's going to be relatively painless, but we need all of those perspectives to understand kind of what is happening with Wenham's water today. So first, we're going to start with what might be a basic question, but just so we're all on the same page, what is a watershed, and specifically, what is the Ipswich River watershed? So a watershed is a geographic area in which all of the water in that area drains downhill. Water always runs downhill to the same body of water. So in this case, the Ipswich River, and eventually then goes through the river and out to the sea. So you can see on this map, this kind of yellowish area is the Ipswich River watershed. Any rain that falls in this yellow area will eventually make its way to the Ipswich River. There are a couple important things to remember about the watershed. One is that this is not a political boundary. I often show this map and people ask who decides what the boundaries of a watershed are. And the answer is no one. No one decides that. It's a naturally occurring feature. It essentially, the watershed boundary essentially connects the local high points. And one of the challenges of watersheds is that all of the water in this region is connected. However, it crosses a lot of political boundaries. In this case, mostly municipal boundaries, but we have multiple towns and parts of towns that all make up the Ipswich River watershed. The other important thing to remember about a watershed is that in addition to the lakes and rivers and streams and wetlands that you see on a map, it also includes all of the groundwater in this region. And that's especially true for the North Shore because we have one connected aquifer in the watershed. And all of our surface waters, all of our rivers and lakes and streams are connected to our groundwater supply. So there is really no difference between groundwater and surface water. Surface water is just areas where the ground dips below the level of the groundwater, and now you can see the water. But they're all connected, and so with things that happen to the groundwater will impact the river. Things that affect the river will ultimately impact the groundwater, and vice versa. So if we zoom in a little bit, and I'm sorry to get blurry because we're getting quite far in on that map. So look at Wenham. Pretty much the whole town of Wenham is in the Ipswich River watershed. And when you think of Wenham's water, you probably first think of Wenham Lake, which is right down the road from here. You probably also think of the Miles River, which tracks, this is Wenham Lake on this map. The Miles River comes out of Wenham Lake and eventually connects with the Ipswich River down in Ipswich. And you might also think of the Salem-Beverly Canal, which is this very straight line on this map. And that's a later addition to the watershed that we'll talk a little bit more about a little later in the presentation. So if we start with the history of Wenham's water, we can go all the way back to pre-colonial times. And I'm going to look at my notes so I get the name of this right. So this area was originally inhabited by the Namkyag tribe of the Massachusetts Nation. And the Namkyag were seasonally nomadic people. So they had summer camps on the coast and at large ponds. And they had winter camps further inland where it was a little bit more sheltered. So one of the major summer camps was on the shores of Wenham Lake. And one of the things that attracted them to that area was because Wenham Lake had an abundant supply of fish at that time, alewife in particular. And the alewife were used both as a food source and as a fertilizer source by the indigenous people in the area. And I will say too, I'm going to refer to this body of water that we know as Wenham Lake throughout the presentation. The name has changed many times in just the history that we know of. And that's not what the indigenous people are calling it, but just for clarity, and so we're all on the same page, I'm going to call it Wenham Lake. Wenham Lake is a freshwater pond. Alewife are ocean-dwelling fish, but they migrate upstream every year to spawn. So the alewife that were spawning in Wenham Lake were coming from the Ipswich River and swimming upstream every year. And that herring run was an important source of food for the indigenous people. And a major reason why they decided to settle in this area. If we move forward a little bit into colonial times, the founding of Wenham is really tied into its water resources. And Kristen talked a little bit about this in the introduction as well. So in the area that is currently known as Wenham, originally spun out of the population center in Salem. So if we think about in the 1630s, Salem started to give land grants in this area, and they were all situated around Wenham Lake, because that was the best place to live at the time. In 1638, Hugh Peter was a preacher who preached a sermon on the shores of Wenham Lake. And you guys might know this story because it's kind of part of local lore. He made a reference during that sermon, drawing from the book of John, and referred to the waters of Enon, which were near Salem, which is a biblical reference, but also ties into the local geography, since we are also near Salem. And from there, the lake became known as Enon Pond, and the town became known as Enon, or the area that would become the town became known as Enon. In 1643, the town was incorporated by the legislature in Boston, and they decided that they were going to change the name from Enon to Wenham. But that is ultimately where the name Wenham comes from, is from that original biblical reference from this particular sermon preached on the shores of Lake Wenham. So we can see that the history of this town in particular is really tied up with its water resources, and that lake in particular has always been at the heart of this community. I also included in this timeline a bit of maybe obscure colonial law. In 1649, they declared that great ponds, no problem, which were ponds over 10 acres, so that would include Wenham Lake. Were declared to be essentially community property, and you were allowed to cross another man's land in order to access great ponds for fishing and fowling. And that emphasizes the fact that the importance of the fish in Wenham Lake still for colonists during this period. They were using the fish for food, and they also adopted the indigenous practice of using fish for fertilizer. So the herring run up to Wenham Lake was incredibly important for those early colonists as well. This piece of law, I think, is also an excellent reflection of the way that people were thinking about ponds as community resources at that time. You could not own a pond, even if you owned all of the area around a great pond. You still had to give your neighbors access to that water source in order to fish, to use the pond for fishing and for fowling. The concept of our waters as a community resource really influences the law that ultimately evolves from this original colonial law, and it influences the way that we think about our water resource today as a community resource. And we'll see that thread kind of continue out through the history of Wenham's waters. So then we move into the next phase of Wenham's water, the ice harvesting industry. This is Wenham Lake's claim to international fame. The ice harvesting industry went on for about 100 years in Wenham, situated at Wenham Lake, and Wenham ice was sent around the globe. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the practice of ice harvesting, when ponds freeze in the winter, they would cut blocks of ice out of them and store them in insulated sheds for use in the warmer months before we had refrigeration. And the Wenham ice harvesting industry started in about the 1840s. A merchant from Salem came out here, established the first ice houses. I'm going to only skim over the top of this because the Wenham Museum does a great job of documenting this piece of Wenham Lake's history. But it struggled, the ice industry struggled for a number of decades, and in the 1870s, it really took off, and Wenham ice was being shipped all over the world. It was said to be a favorite ice of Queen Victoria, which is a fun piece of local lore. And it was so popular that a lake in Norway actually renamed itself Wenham Lake in kind of a copycat move so that they could also market their ice as Wenham Lake ice and take advantage of the fact that this was kind of considered a premier ice brand at the time. And one of the reasons that Wenham Lake ice was so valued and such a high quality ice, it goes all the way back to what I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation. Wenham Lake is naturally a spring-fed lake, which means that it draws its water directly from the groundwater. And lakes that are fed directly from groundwater tend to be very clear. In converse, lakes that get water from surface water sources like streams and rivers tend to be a bit murkier because they pick up those contaminants as they run across the land. And so the reason that Wenham Lake's ice was so valuable was directly tied into that hydrology of the region and the fact that we have such a great groundwater source in this region. And that brings us to essentially what I think of as the modern era of Wenham Lake's history. And it starts, and that is the establishment of the Salem and Beverly Water Supply Board and the use of Wenham Lake as a drinking water supply. And I consider it the modern era because we really feel the implications of these decisions still today. But it started all the way back in 1863. A group of Salem residents petitioned the city council to secure the water that they would need in the city of Salem for their residential and commercial use and as well as future growth. So the city council in Salem started studying the available sources of water, and they decided that the water sources that they currently had were not sufficient. So they petitioned the legislature in Boston, and the legislature granted Wenham Lake to the city of Salem as a drinking water source. It also provided that the towns of Wenham, Hamilton, Danvers, and Peabody could also use Wenham Lake water for their drinking water supplies. But I will note that none of those towns have ever taken advantage of that. The kind of modern water supply system in Wenham was established in around the 1940s, and it drew from well water. So Wenham Lake has always been Salem's drinking water and not Wenham's drinking water supply. Yes. So this was in 1868. Salem first started receiving Wenham Lake water in the city of Salem for drinking water. And at the time, it was the city of Salem, not the Salem and Beverly Water Supply Board, which is a later iteration of that. In 1872, they built a low earth dam on Wenham Lake at the outlet of the lake to raise the lake level. And it added about 200 million gallons of capacity to Wenham Lake because the city of Salem and Beverly now needed even more water. It also very effectively blocked the fish passage into Wenham Lake, very effectively and unintentionally, because the dam sits at the outlet of Aylward Brook at Wenham Lake. It became apparent that yet more water was going to be needed for the cities of Salem and Beverly. So in 1880, they dug a canal to drain Cedar Pond into Wenham Lake to add more water. And then, which is not the canal that we currently think of when we think of the Salem-Beverly Canal. That canal was dug in 1917. And at this point, it was owned by the Salem-Beverly Water Board, which is the current water supplier for Salem and Beverly. It's a private company. It inherited Wenham Lake from the city of Salem, as well as a number of other reservoirs throughout the Ipswich River watershed to provide their drinking water supplies. They're responsible for digging the canal, which functions as a way to bring Ipswich River water directly from the river into Wenham Lake in a process called flood skimming. And so essentially what they do is during periods of high flow, which are the winter months in this region, they take water from the Ipswich River, divert it to Wenham Lake and fill the lake, which is then it's used as storage for the summer months, which is when we have less precipitation in this region in the summer. And it's also by far our highest volume water use period. You will also notice, as I've talked about the use of Wenham Lake as a reservoir, there's been a number of canals that have supplemented the supply of Wenham Lake. And so therefore, Wenham Lake is not solely groundwater fed anymore. It gets a lot of surface water added to it in addition to the natural springs at the bottom of the lake. And as a result, the water quality in the lake has changed significantly. So it is not the same water that was used to make ice for Queen Victoria now. And it requires a reasonable amount of treatment before you can actually drink it. And so that's what the Salem Beverly Water Board does with Wenham Lake's water, is treat it and then send it to those cities for use as drinking water.
And you said the canal was built in 1970?
1917.
Yeah.
And that's the
At
Cedar
same
Pond
time
now.
as the Cedar Pond.
The Cedar Pond one
That's
was earlier, and that canal was not. Sometimes it's referred to as canal, and sometimes it's referred to as a ditch. So I don't think it was an engineering marvel.
Functioning?
No, I don't think
There's
so.
nothing draining from Cedar Pond.
No. So the next question that I get asked when I bring up the Salem Beverly Water Board is, how come they don't have to follow the rules like everyone else? And that's particularly apparent during droughts, which is what happened this past summer, where you drive around and everybody's under water bans except for Salem and Beverly. So we can talk a little bit about why Salem and Beverly don't have to follow the rules. And we go to the Water Management Act of Massachusetts, Water Management Act of 1986. So we're talking just a little less than 40 years ago now. This was Massachusetts' first legislation that really regulated water withdrawals and water permitting. Essentially what they did is they asked large-scale municipal water users to register their water use between 1981 1985. And Salem Beverly Water Board, as a long-established large-scale municipal system, registered their water use. And essentially what that means is they have a registration. And if you have a registration, you're grandfathered in from all of the subsequent water conservation efforts. So Salem and Beverly never have to conserve water legally because they have this registration and they basically predate any of Massachusetts' efforts to conserve water at all. And so that causes a lot of problems and a lot of conflicts and a lot of opinions about how we're managing our water resources. But it's this flawed Water Management Act of 1986 that is specifically to blame for that kind of patchwork of regulations and legislations that we see around the watershed today.
Erin, did other towns and municipalities, did they register as well? Or I don't think I understand that.
Yeah, it was only available to specific large scale water suppliers. So because Salem Beverly is by far the largest water supplier, they were allowed to register, and Wenham does not have a registration.
Okay.
Most towns on the North Shore do not have registration. So most towns, like if you drive through downtown Ipswich, you probably see the big water ban sign. They are also subject to the same conservation rules that Wenham is, that Salem and Beverly are exempt from. So challenges to the Ipswich River today. So first we'll talk about dams. You guys will probably remember just a few minutes ago that I talked about alewife a number of times in Wenham's history, and that's because alewife were critically important to the early settlers in this area, both indigenous and colonial, and one of the reasons that people live on the North Shore at all. The construction of dams, and specifically the Ipswich Mills Dam, has effectively cut off all of the herring runs in the Ipswich River. There is a very small, pretty insignificant herring run currently. The Ipswich Mills Dam, which is in downtown Ipswich, is the primary blockage to fish passage, mostly because of its location. It's right at where the river, the fresh water from the river and the salt water from the ocean meet. So it effectively blocks all the fish coming in from the ocean, and it's also the largest dam. It does have a fish ladder, so this concrete structure here is a fish ladder. You can see it if you're ever in downtown Ipswich and see the dam. That's what that's intended to do. It's not great. Not a lot of fish get through, and a lot of wildlife actually gets stuck in the ladder. So we the Ipswich River Watershed Association is actively working with the town of Ipswich to have this dam removed. It functions as a dam, but it's not used for anything. It used to provide power to the mills in downtown Ipswich, but it hasn't for many decades. We're also working to remove other dams across the watershed, as well as install more effective fish passage solutions in areas where full dam removal is not feasible for a number of reasons. And so we're hoping that with all of those efforts, we can actually get an alewife run back and a substantial herring run back in the Ipswich River. We have seen success with that in other rivers in Massachusetts. So we're kind of cautiously optimistic that the efforts for dam removal around the watershed are going to result in some improved fish habitats. The main challenge to the Ipswich River today and to Wenham's water is over extraction. So this graph here is municipal water withdrawals. So this gets exactly at the issue. This light blue line here is the water allocated to all of these different communities from the Ipswich River in million gallons per day. And you can see that the Salem and Beverly get more than twice as much water allocated to them as the next closest community, which is Lynn. Usually when you see this graph, you only see this light blue line. I added in the dark blue lines, which is the allocation for all of these communities per person. So I just took the allocation divided by the number of residents. And you can still see Salem and Beverly make out pretty well, but it's a little bit more even than it looks when you're just looking at the light blue line. The other thing that the Water Management Act, in addition to it codifying these registrations, which exempted some people from having to conserve water, it also established a safe yield for the rivers in Massachusetts. And what that means is it quantified how much water you can take out of a river watershed and still maintain the health of the river. And the Ipswich River exceeds its safe yield and has actually since the beginning of time, since the beginning of this, when they started permitting water use. So all of the existing permits and registrations take more water out of the river than the river can sustainably provide. The other major challenge with extraction water from the Ipswich River is that you'll see that all of the highest volume water using towns, so Salem, Beverly, Lynn, Peabody, Danvers, they are all outside of the Ipswich River watershed. So they're piping water from our watershed to supply those cities. And the big problem with that, or challenge to the river, is that once that water is used, it never comes back into our watershed. It never ends up back in the river. It gets treated and ultimately ends in the ocean. But that puts a tremendous amount of strain on the Ipswich River, that we export about 80% of the water that we withdraw from the river. We end up exporting outside of the watershed to those communities. And this picture over here is the Miles River, Wenham's major river. And during this summer, when the drought hit us particularly hard, and this stretch of the river dried up. Stretches of the Ipswich River and its tributaries go dry almost every year, but that's especially true during drought. And it becomes this issue of over extraction becomes very visible when we have drought conditions like we did this summer. All right, so then possible solutions, what can we do? So ultimately, water conservation, water conservation, water conservation. We already exceed our safe yield. We are already using too much water, and there is no more water to take out of the Ipswich River. That means as our population and our economy grows, we have to live within our existing allocations forever. There's no way to make more Ipswich River water. So when we talk about water conservation, there's a number of individual actions we can take, from turning off the tap when you brush your teeth, installing low flow appliances, taking shorter showers. That's my least favorite one. But the major water use in our region is outdoor water use. I mentioned earlier that our water use spikes in the summertime months when the rainfall is the lowest. And that is because of lawn watering and pool filling. And so to tackle water use in our region, we really have to start thinking about where we're using our water and where can we cut back. And Greenscapes has been working really hard to beat the drum about sustainable landscaping. So think about how much water your garden and lawn requires and how can we cut that back. And this Greenscapes guide, I have a few copies of them back there. You're welcome to take one or flip through it. But eventually, essentially it just boils down to we should be using native plants that can grow in our region without having to be watered constantly. And we should think about reducing the size of our lawns so that we don't have to irrigate so many acres with Ipswich River water. The other piece of water conservation is what I'm calling community actions. And that is things that our towns can do. So there are a number of solutions that we've put forward. We recently published what we're calling a recipe for water resiliency. And it's a step-by-step guide for towns to implement an enhanced water conservation plan. There are a number of ways to offset your water use. You can install rainwater collection systems, which are a great way to get more water for the irrigation that you have to do. You can require developers to use water efficient appliances and to offset the water that they do have to use by helping the town pay for other water conservation efforts. I know the Wenham Museum has done a whole green landscaping effort where they're using rainwater for their lawns and gardens as well. So we're really pushing for municipal officials, some of whom are here today, to think about having water conservation be a priority for the town, and we're here to help you implement it. And I will say too, when I talk to town officials and I talk about water conservation, no one ever says to me, oh, we don't really want to do that. The problem is it's the capacity, right? It's like everybody has a million things going on and there's different priorities. And our point and our mission is that this should be one of our priorities. And let's put the resources into the conservation to address some of these challenges. Another solution is Mass DEP, which is the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. They administer the Water Resources Program. They're working towards amendments, which they have guaranteed that they're going to have done by the end of the year, because it's one of Governor Baker's priorities to do before he gets out of office, that would address the inequalities in the water conservation restrictions that make it so there are different rules that apply to different entities. So they're actively looking at this right now to require restrictions during droughts on everyone. And I think this is an excellent first step, but I will say that this only applies to restrictions during drought. It doesn't address any of the concerns that we have for all of the times that we're not in drought and we're still exceeding the safe yield of the river. Another possible solution, so collaboration and new supplies. A couple of weeks ago, there was a charter signing for the North Shore Water Resiliency Task Force. And what this is it's headed by Senator Tarr's office. And it is a task force of all of the communities that rely on Ipswich River water. So the entire watershed, plus all of those towns outside of the watershed, as well as the Salem Beverly Water Supply Board, the Ipswich River Watershed Association. And it's an agreement that everyone is going to work together to figure out the solution to the water supply issue on the North Shore. It's historic in that there has never been an agreement that all of these towns are going to talk to each other civilly about how our water resources can be managed. And there's a lot of optimism that that's going to produce some productive collaboration. The first thing that the task force is working on is they got some funding to evaluate what are our options to expand water supplies in the Ipswich River watershed. And there are two options under consideration. One is to tap into MWRA water. The MWRA is the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority. They own and run the Quabbin Reservoir, which is out in the middle of the state. And it was originally built to provide Boston and the surrounding communities with water. they have excess capacity, and so they're actually looking to expand their footprint and provide water to more communities. So there's a study ongoing right now about how much it would cost to bring some of this Quabbin Reservoir water up to the North Shore. And then option 2 is to build a new reservoir in Topsfield. The Salem Beverly Water Supply Board already owns a parcel in Topsfield that is a site for a potential new reservoir. It would function much like Wenham Lake does now, where they would skim water from the river in the winter during periods of high flow and then use it in the summer. The biggest challenge to that reservoir is that Route 1, which is the road in this picture, runs right through the middle of the reservoir site. So in order to build the reservoir, you have to elevate a section of Route 1 above the future lake, which makes that incredibly expensive. And the other downside is you would end up flooding this lovely valley in Topsfield. But it is a potential additional water supply source that's under consideration. And hopefully in the next few months, the task force will have more kind of data on which of those options is the best one to expand.
Where is that site exactly? Can you describe it?
Yeah, this is Route 1. It's right by Witch Hill, the Pierce Farm. Yeah,
So it would be include Witch Hill?
so Witch Hill would be like one side of it.
On the south of it? South side.
If Witch Hill's on your right as you're driving down Route 1, it's the next valley.
The next side, so
Yeah.
after the south of Witch Hill.
Yes, just after Witch Hill. Yeah, it's one of a few sites actually in Massachusetts where you could potentially build a reservoir where the topography works out. But the thing about reservoirs is that we built the best spots for reservoirs first. And so every subsequent reservoir that you build ends up being a little less efficient than the one before, or a little more expensive.
And how would this one compare in size to Wenham Lake? Approximately.
It would be a similar size to Wenham Lake. It would not replace Wenham Lake. It would just be an additional reservoir. It would be actually a 4th reservoir for Salem Beverly. It would also probably mean that Salem Beverly, or potentially the Salem Beverly Water Supply Board, would supply water outside of Salem Beverly to other communities.
Why don't you just draw from the aquifer? Why do you have to have an above ground?
Well, this is essentially a storage tank. So the surface water and the groundwater are the same water. So what this is doing is making it so that water that is in the watershed in the winter stays in the watershed for future use. I mean, it's essentially a big storage tank. So the water that, when it snows in January and it melts, say it melts in January and it goes into the river, it ends up in the ocean before we can use it. What a reservoir does is just hold back that water for a period of months or years so that you can use the water. I'm almost done, and then we can continue this conversation. How can Wenham residents get involved? Well, my whole message is just engage. Like I said, nobody says we don't want to conserve water. Everybody, it's just not a priority. You can engage with state decision makers by supporting the Water Management Act amendments that are currently open for public comment. There's been a number of drought bills over the years that have never made it to this legislature for a vote. So we always encourage people to call. There's state representatives and state senators and say we want a drought bill. Sign up for email notifications, that's very self-serving, but the Ipswich River Watershed Association does send out email notifications when things like this are before the legislature, so that we can voice our support for it. And then also engage with town decision makers, because even though the state can make all these rules and regulations and legislation, ultimately the way that water is managed is a town decision. And it's really important to know how your town is managing water, how they're thinking about conserving water, how they're thinking about dealing with the issues of water supply going forward. And I know we have a few town officials here, so I guess we can. Yeah.
I have a question for one of our folks on Zoom. They would like to know, is the task force looking at standard fines for water ban violations sharing statistics of effectiveness, and perhaps raising fees to be more punitive?
So the decision to enforce water bans is up to the individual towns, and enforcement varies a lot. So, legally, the towns would get to make that decision themselves. I guess that what the task force could do potentially is get everyone on the same page. I don't think that has been discussed currently. It is an option for changing behavior. And and then this is also a very self-serving slide, but leveraging the Greenscapes North Shore Coalition. We're a resource for towns. We would love to work with towns. We encourage you guys to reach out to us for help implementing any ideas, for help getting more resources. We apply for grants on behalf of our towns to get us the resources we need to ultimately implement some of these solutions. And that is really my last slide. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to take questions.
We also have as well after Q&A, Ernest Ashley from the Town of Wenham's Water Commission had a couple of things he wanted to add. So, but first Q&A. So, yeah.
So I'm actually one of the people who steals Wenham Lake water. So my question is, so I can't really see from back here. So the per capita use of water for Salem and Watershed, is it significantly higher than the per capita use of water for people who live in other towns?
So the answer is it's surprisingly hard to answer because in addition to Salem and Beverly not having to conserve water during droughts, any private well owner that withdraws less than 100,000 gallons per day also is exempt from restrictions. And there are a lot of private wells in the Ipswich River watershed, and there are fewer in Salem and Beverly just because there's not it's not a rural community where private wells are a thing. And there's no way for us to measure how much water the private wells are using, which is why I'm always hesitant to say, we always refer to allocations rather than use because we don't have a specific number.
So they're not under the same restrictions?
No,
Well, although they're drawing from the same aquifer.
no, they're not under any restrictions as long as you stay under the 100,000.
And
Yeah,
I
that's
don't know how
okay.
likely they are. Our water restrictions include private wells.
They can,
true?
Just in Wenham.
yeah, so it can be a town decision, and I guess Wenham has pursued that, but it's not a state restriction. Yeah.
I just say it's quite disturbing, sorry, to drive through Beverly and see the lawns being sprinkled when everybody else is on a water conservation. I'm not trying to pick on them, but I think they should have some goodwill to restrict some things as in long watering during periods of high drought.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I will say I also am a water thief because I live in Salem. Most,
But I don't have a lot in their apartment.
because there's no requirement to conserve, and there's no reason that the Salem Beverly Water Board has to publicize the fact that we're in a drought. Most Salem residents don't know that we're in a drought. They don't drive by the Ipswich River, so they don't see that impact, and there's no official telling them that they're in a drought. And I think, do we put that on the residents watering their lawn, or do we put it on the people who are not educating their public? Yeah.
You mentioned the canal feeding Wenham Lake.
Mhm.
Now, I'm told, feeds the reservoir and dam from Danvers to Cedar Street, Wenham Lake.
The reservoirs are connected.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I always thought it came from the canal, but I was told, no, it goes to Danvers Reservoir to Cedar Street.
Cedar Street. I don't know where-
To the pipe.
Yeah, oh, yeah. Mhm,
I thought.
mhm.
I'm a resident of Cedar Street, and I've been told it comes from both places. That there are pipes that lead from the reservoir, and there are pipes that come from the canal. Because, I can tell you, because I go by that pipe every single day, there is water gushing from that pipe, and there has been for months.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of thing where, you know, you just say to yourself, boy, I hope they've got the right spigot turned on. I think what's most discouraging for me is that Wenham finds people who are using sprinklers during a drought. So that brings in money, but it doesn't cut back on the water usage.
Yeah.
And that's what's hard, is that, you know, yikes. And then you have people who have pools. You cannot get any water company to bring you an inch of water to fill your pool. And if your pool goes down a certain amount, it will break. So, you know, you sit there and watch your neighbor across the street whose sprinkler is going at 8 o'clock at night. So, I mean, I agree with the water bans, and we talk about non-essential, but I think we have to look at what non-essential means. Because otherwise we have to tell everybody, you have to shut all your pools down. Because you can't add. Yeah, keep adding water to it. It's delicate, it's tricky.
One of the challenges, I mean, the question that we got from Zoom too about issuing fines for enforcement or increasing the price of water as a control measure. People tend to be pretty price insensitive to water, and that's for two reasons. One, water is pretty cheap. And so it's usually your cheapest utility bill, and so therefore people think about like turning off their lights to reduce their power bill. That people don't really think about reducing water because your water bill is usually not that high, unless you have a pool or a big lawn, in which case you usually have enough money that the fine or the increase in price doesn't change your behavior and you just pay it. So it's very hard for a municipal water supplier to price water perfectly to control behavior while still protecting essential use. It's a delicate balance. Maybe
Thank you, Erin. I thought it was a great talk. I learned quite a few things. I'm Ernest Ashley. I'm the chair of the Wenham Water Commission. And I thought if the name of the talk was Wenham Water, I should speak about Wenham's water. So the few things that I think we'll come to is, you know, where is our water coming from? And she's covered some of that. I'll be more specific. We've talked a lot about how much there is, how can we conserve, and what do we have to do to keep it clean? And let's see if I just.
you hit the right.
There we go. So where does the water come from? It comes from two wells that are just south of Pleasant Pond. And so this is Pleasant Street, and it's just as you make this big corner, there's our water pumping system. And that has two wells. They're 50 and 85 feet deep. They're draining from what's called a confined aquifer, which means there's some layers on top of it. But the water is essentially coming through the Great Wenham Swamp. And that provides for a very, very good filter, as well as the gravels that we're drawing from. So it's pretty high quality water. And there is a widespread clay layer. We've even looked into Pleasant Pond. Does it go down through that? And we had to do some testing to make sure that there was no direct connection there. It's pumped to two large tanks that then gravity feed throughout the town. And we do treat the water. We treat it with chlorine to kill bacteria and viruses. And we also treat it with a compound to prevent lead and copper from leaching out of the pipes, which was the problem in Flint, Michigan. And then lastly, we add fluoride, which has been shown to be a very, very significant public health addition right there. So we call it the ultimate renewable resource because when it rains, we do get our water systems recharged. And as Erin described, with water skimming is what happens from the Beverly Salem Water Board. They take water when there's a surplus in the Ipswich River that otherwise is going straight out to the sea. But then come May, they have to stop. And you may have noticed Wenham Lake has come back up somewhat. It's still a drought. What they're doing is draining Putnamville Reservoir, filling up Wenham Lake so that they can add water to Putnamville when they start taking water out of the Ipswich River again. So although Salem Beverly is watering their lawns, they're not pulling it out of the groundwater during that time frame. But we are. In Wenham, we have a ultimate, I believe it is a registration for 142 million gallons per year. Our water bans are triggered not by our well capacities going down, but by the water levels in the Ipswich River. This graph up here is the most recent graph of the water levels in the Ipswich River. That number is 0.43 gallons or cubic feet per second going over the dams in Ipswich. That's not much. Our trigger is 52.5 cubic feet per second, I believe. And so you can see that's up in here. So in the spring, we'll have a tremendous amount of water in that river system. But in the spring, also, all of our trees and lawns are just taking up everything. So the water recharge comes right now when the trees start to lose their leaves and we get these heavy rains in the fall. That's when our system comes up. But you can see it hasn't come up yet because the flows in the Ipswich River are still very, very low. But what I can report is that our conservation efforts have been pretty successful of late. This that you can't see are some statistics that we look at the Water Commission meetings, which was last week. And so what it's saying here is our residential use, somebody asked about gallons per person per day. And the state has a target of 65 gallons per person per day. I have to put my specs on to even be able to read this, but it has gone down from the 70s at 86 to the 80s at 85 to the 90s, went back up to 82. 75, 68, and in the 2000s, which we only had 2 years, where it's 59. So you can see people are starting to pay attention somewhat. And then the other thing that we have as our statistic is just basically our total use, which is up here at the top. And it's it's running at about 125 million gallons per year. Now, there are development pressures in Wenham, one of which is a development potential out by Gordon College. And the other is the MBTA properties are being asked to have additional population close to there. So we're getting close to that 142 if we're running at 125. And using those kind of calculations of gallons per person per day, we could be looking at another 18 million gallons per year, which would push us over this registered withdrawal amount. And as Erin mentioned, this is already a situation where there's an excess withdrawal capacity to what has been identified as the safe yield. But as I mentioned, we've had some pretty good communication efforts. What do we do as far as tickets? First, if we see people and we're perfectly happy to get a call that says so-and-so is watering their lawn that they shouldn't be, we actually have to see it to be able to write a ticket. And we will usually write a letter explaining the bylaws. Our bylaws do extend to private wells, which was a pretty big accomplishment for this town. I've been involved in some of Middleton's efforts, and they are violently almost opposed to applying it. But again, we are in the same bucket. So what do? We could do greenscaping where you don't use nearly as much water. Certainly, if you let your lawns grow warm, we emphasize during our regular water conservation methods, do not water between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. when it's all going to go up for evaporation. But here, the numbers on this side basically show that in the summertime, what is our normal daily use, you can calculate during the winter when nobody's watering their lawn or washing their car. We're running in the 7 to 9 million gallons a month. And in the summertime, we're up to 17. So, but this past year, compared with 2 years ago, last year, we weren't in a drought. We didn't have any water ban the entire year. And so if you compare our use this year to 2 years ago, where this year was even more severe of a drought, we've used significantly less water. So the conservation message is getting out. And I think the citizens should be complimented. We have a few people that, as she says, if they've got the money, I can give them $100 ticket. I can give them $100 ticket once a day if it was that way, but typically we found people to be pretty responsive when we provide them with a letter first, a warning second, a ticket third, and usually that ticket says, oh, wait a second, they are serious. It's not very consequential. It's $50 the first ticket and $100 after that. But nonetheless, it does drive home somewhat of a message. So thanks very much. Okay,
Ernest,
questions?
what do you think with such great conservation outcomes? What do you think is the best efforts that you guys have done to communicate the importance of the residents?
I'm not sure. I mean, obviously the notes have been effective, but I think there's a community pressure. When you saw how bad the drought was this year, people did say, you know, that lawn of yours looks mighty green. It kind of stands out when everybody else is dealing with death
Right.
of the lawn. And now we have taken away our signs because our water conservation measures are through the 30th of September. And we have gone from a category 3 to a category 2, significant, not critical drought. But again, what they're saying, the state is don't water between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Yes, sir.
You and Erin both mentioned that conservation efforts are slowly succeeding. But Erin also mentioned capacity. And I think we sort of did too when we talked about the future development. And isn't the future development, because I know in Hamilton there's some significant development taking place. Isn't that going to far outweigh any conservation efforts? And has any thought been given to, say, moratorium on building? That ever come up?
It has not been something that the water department can say to the town, you can't develop because of water. This registration of 142 million gallons is somewhat arbitrary. It's not how much water we actually have in our well that we can pump. But you're correct in that water regulation and legislation is very separate from development. Right now, the push in the governor's office and everything is let's build affordable housing. Let's put it by the MBTA and other things. So I think there has to be some reckoning that how many people can the Ipswich River water basins sustain even with conservation measures? And the big one is going to be, can we stop watering our lawns? We call it irrigation, but it's really lawn watering. And that, you know, I say from a Wenham standpoint, we have enough water for our domestic use, but we can't afford to waste it in that respect.
I will say, when you look at the nation as a whole, our municipal water use, which is the water that gets piped to all of the residents, has gone down over the past few decades, even though our population has gone up. And that's, I mean, there's some behavior change in there. A lot of it is technology because our appliances are so much more efficient now. And so people are saving water without even knowing that they're saving water. And so I think that's still where the conversation is, that we haven't reached a point of absolute scarcity. It's more about conserving water. And there are technological systems too. I mean, there's a lot of systems where you can recycle water and use it over and over again on site. That makes new developments very efficient.
I want to finish with one thing. As Erin mentioned, there are cities where they take the water from the Ipswich River Basin and they put it into basically Salem Harbor. It's going out of the basin. Wenham is not one of those communities. We're on 100% septic, and that presents its own issues. What that means is everything that we put into those systems goes into the groundwater. Everything that we put into this system goes into the groundwater, ultimately. So what we put on our lawns goes in there. So what I'm noting is we should not discharge anything like oils, lubricants, solvents, paints, chemicals, prescription medications. Those go in the trash, not flushed down the toilet, because very, very low levels of things like estrogen disruptors can go right into the groundwater, and those are not effectively filtered out through things. And also mercury. Take anything that has mercury in your house and recycle it or put it in a hazardous waste bin. We, every year in June, issue the consumer confidence report, and it tells you what is in your water. And in general, our water is very, very high quality, but that doesn't mean there are not some chemicals and metals naturally occurring and man-made that are in those waters. And we test our water frequently. We are testing for the forever compounds that you have heard about monthly, and our concentrations are well below the state's maximum contaminant level. But these compounds are ubiquitous in our environment because we've all had fast booze wrappers that have some on it. We've all sat on Scotch Guard. We've all worn Gore-Tex. We've all used Teflon. It's in our environment. But luckily, our concentrations have been such that we don't perceive that as a problem coming up. But should it become such a level, we would have to put on some type of treatment system on our thing. And right now, the treatment we have, as I mentioned, we installed a very large pipe loop in the vicinity of our pumping system so that we can put the minimum amount of chlorine and have the residence time sufficient that when it goes into the system, it sanitizes the water, but doesn't smell like a pool.
That's got a lot better when it was first done.
When it first was, it was
Now.
called emergency, and we used sodium hypochlorite, which is bleach. And now we're using a different form, and again, took the steps to minimize the amount of
Is there any point at all about even thinking about building another well? Because there used to be a well up on Lord's Hill, wasn't there?
Again, you get to the capacity of the basin, and so there is a prohibition against actually replacing, doing, another well, because you're taking it out of the same bucket.
But I was just thinking about the whole skimming thing.
Mhm.
Could we have a well with skim water?
Yeah, we could put a pipe into that canal there, and just take some water every once in a while, and put it back into our system.
Listen, it occurred to me to go down and take buckets of water out of it like this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say about a well too. You have to think about a well is like a straw. It goes into the groundwater, you suck it out, and it's not a storage facility. It's not a tank. So Wenham uses their wells like a straw. They suck the water out and they put it in storage tanks. So you can't flood skim water and store it in a well. You would have to flood skim it and put it in a storage tank. So that's reducing emission.
But I think the bucket concept is
Yeah.
every bit of water taken out. This is why I'm proud that we as a community did have a bylaw applying to private wells. Because that water that you've taken out of that thing no longer has the head to flow down to the river. So every drop we take out of it is a drop that is essentially not going to the Ipswich River. Thank you all very much.